This is an ABC News Live special report. The Biden-Putin Summit.
Hi, everyone. You're watching continuing coverage of the Biden-Putin Summit here on ABC News Live. Good morning. I'm Diane Macedo. Right now, President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are there in Geneva at the Via Lagrange about to have their meeting. Highly anticipated summit here. We saw the two leaders arrive. They shook hands. They went inside. And inside, during a photo op, we heard a little bit from both of them. It was hard to hear. There were a lot of people talking in the room, but Russian President Vladimir Putin talked about his desire. I hope our meeting is a productive one, and said the U.S. and Russia have accumulated a lot of issues. President Biden echoed those sentiments, adding that it's always better to meet face to face, and again expressed his desire for the U.S. and Russia to have a predictable relationship. The day will set off with two meetings. One will be a smaller one, currently just the two leaders there, as well as the Secretary of State and the Russian foreign minister. And then they will have another meeting with a larger delegation. And then we will hear from both of them separately. We are not going to see a side-by-side press conference with the Russian president the way we saw after his summit with President Trump. President Biden instead is opting to hold a separate press conference after today. I want to bring in our political director, Rick Klein, for a little bit more on all of this. Rick, big picture here, what do you think both of these men are looking to come away with, and what do you make of the little things we've seen so far, the way they shook hands, the fact that they both showed up on time, their body language in the room, and the way they answered some of those quick questions?
Yeah, even the way that Joe Biden crossed his legs, looking very comfortable, very casual. He's been coached on body language. Putin, of course, a master of it. You see him there sprawled out a little bit like he owns the place. They are feeling each other out, even though these are two men that know each other quite well. They're prepared for a long series of conversations, and then perhaps just as importantly, what comes out of it, those separate news conferences. And they're prepared to put their own spins on what transpires. From the United States perspective, this is about stability, security, predictability. It's not about a breakthrough. We've heard president after president talk about a reset with Russia and to start over in Russian relationships, going back to at least George W. Bush, if not Bill Clinton. That has been something that U.S. presidents have talked about, specifically with Vladimir Putin. This is not on the agenda today. That isn't what Joe Biden wants. Joe Biden wants to de-escalate some of the tensions, and there are a long list of them and a lot of concerns that are hitting people directly, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. But from the perspective of the Russians, Putin is already seeing this as a bit of a victory to have this meeting. And he knows this. He knows the game quite well. He's got almost total control of his own country, of the messaging that comes out of this. He doesn't have to worry about that pesky little thing called democracy back home. He can make promises that are quite a bit different, and he can frankly lie about what happens with a lot less accountability. These are two men that know each other. They know each other well. They know their countries well, and they're going in with everything from the body language on up with firm ideas about what they need to get done.
And I want to bring in Steve Ganyard, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Steve, this is the first time that Biden, in official capacity as president, is going on the world stage to make clear to Vladimir Putin what is acceptable to the U.S. and what is not. How important is the way that he plays it, and how does he have to play this to show strength to Putin without antagonizing him?
Yeah, that's the key point, Diane. I think that what President Biden needs to do is to set some red lines to show his hand in terms of what will happen the next time the Russians hack either critical infrastructure in the U.S. or do things like the DNC hack. They need to see pain. Putin only responds to pain. He doesn't respond to jawing and to threats and being called names. He only responds when something threatens his stability and his power within Russia. And so President Biden is going to lay out some very strong red lines on, in my administration, these will be the things that you will not do. And if you do them, these are the kinds of responses you're going to get. So it won't be threatening. It's, you have been doing these things. You will stop them, and here will be the consequences. I think that this is important to President Biden because he has very ambitious domestic political goals that he wants to focus on. In terms of international relations, he has China. If you looked at both the G7 and NATO, the key communiques there, the things that were new where the focus on China and the threat that China presents. And so I think that President Biden is trying to put Putin in a box for his 4 years. He has other things he needs to think about. I think the fact that he's meeting with Putin so early in his administration suggests that that's what he wants to do. Give Putin his red line, say, stay in your box, I have other things to do, and make it clear to Putin that there will be consequences if his behavior continues.
And I want to bring in Elizabeth Newman, former DHS Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy. Elizabeth, this all comes right on the heels of these massive cyber attacks that, of course, the American public is going to be very familiar with. What do you think Biden's top priority needs to be when addressing Putin's actions, not only in terms of the world, but in terms of U.S. security?
You're right. Cyber is such a hot topic that he's going to have to raise. But there's two elements to it. There are the aspects that have been perpetrated by the Russian government itself, by the security services. And the SolarWinds attack was so massive, it really kind of reset the framing for cybersecurity professionals to understand what is acceptable forms of espionage and what is actually an act of war. And there's still debate today whether or not we should consider the SolarWinds attack an act of war, not just traditional espionage. And part of the reason that debate's still underway is because we're still trying to understand how much they were able to infiltrate and the damage that has been caused. So that conversation is, you can clearly pin on Putin. There is no way that happens without Putin's knowledge. The cyber criminal issue, it is one more of complicity. You have hackers trying to make money operating within Russian territory because they know as long as they do not attack people within Russia, that the Russian security services will leave them alone. That seems like it might possibly be something that Putin could offer to do. I don't know that he cares about these criminal gangs. I know he uses them from time to time to be able to achieve his ends. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some sort of a demonstration of good faith where he rounds up a few of them and throws them over to us. See, I'm helping you. But he's strategic that way, right? He's going to look for a way to show like he's a good partner. I wouldn't trust him though, right? Like he has been around for 20 years. He has fooled many presidents. We've thought that he was interested in joining the world stage and actually being a good member of the international community. That is not his intention. That is not his aim. So while I think it's important for very strong and tough messages to be delivered by President Biden behind closed doors, even if we see something out of that, I'm just not going to trust it very far because his 10, 20 years of history shows us that he is in it for the long game, and his intentions run in conflict with what our view of the way we should all be operating on the world stage. Nonetheless, strong, tough message needs to be sent to him, and that I agree with what Rick and others have said. This is not about a reset. If anything, this is more about being very clear that America is back, and we are going to work with our partners and hold him accountable. He has been too provocative. He's gone too far, and he needs to get back in his box.
And our senior national correspondent, Terry Moran, is with us now as well. Terry, we just got the ABC Ipsos poll out on Sunday, and it showed nearly half of the public have either a great deal or a good amount of trust in Biden to negotiate with Putin. For Trump, that came in just over 3 in 10. 32% of Americans felt that way in July of 2017. Now, each president has their own style of doing these kinds of things every time you have a big summit like this. And while Biden has said that he felt President Trump, acquiesced too much to Putin during their summit, he did have two teams prepping going into this. One who was advocating that he take a softer approach, another team that was advocating that he take a harder approach. And while he has displayed that he wants to show strength today, he has also made clear that this administration wants to lead with diplomacy. So how do you think he'll reconcile those two things in this meeting?
Well, it's clear that he wants to go into the meeting and see how Vladimir Putin is going to handle him. He knows, given his experience, that Putin is a very canny a very, very canny adversary. He has played many American presidents like a fiddle. I mean, George W. Bush, he was amused by the fact this former KGB officer who was amused by George W. Bush telling the world, I looked into this man's eyes and I saw his soul. And Putin's reaction, you could almost see, was, what's a soul? And then Barack Obama, whom he despised, and who he nevertheless utterly stunned when he sent troops into Syria. Obama said, well, I don't have to worry about Russia that much because it's a regional power. And Putin said, I'll show you regional power. And he put troops in Syria and changed the equation, saved the regime of Bashar al-Assad there to America's dismay. He is a very dangerous adversary because he's an opportunist. He reads his opponent. And I think President Biden came with those two choices because he, too, is a very veteran, savvy negotiator. He comes from a different perspective. Biden's rules of negotiation are, first, always keep your word. That is not in President Putin's playbook. Second, never try to embarrass your opponent. And that's not in President Putin's playbook. And the third is always make it about the deal. Don't go after personal motives. And that's something that they can probably agree on. Vladimir Putin is basically a cynic. He is an opportunist, and he's a nationalist. And if there is room to do a deal, or at least to calm the waters, that's what both men have in common right here. They want a stable, calmer relationship. And if they both want that, given their experience, they're likely to get it.
I can't hear. Stop.
Well, I'll just keep going. They're likely to get it because, at least for a time, I do think that the comparison between Biden and Trump is a little unfair. Joe Biden is a known quantity to the American people for decades. When President Trump went to Helsinki and I was there, he was still the disruptor on the world stage. Americans didn't really know how he'd be, and there was obviously a very divisive mood in the country at that time. Biden gets credit just for being around for so long, I think, from Americans. They know he's not going to go crazy in this meeting. They didn't really know that about President Trump. And at the end of the day, when he sold out the U.S. intelligence community, saying he believes Vladimir Putin over America's own intelligence community, he proved that he was a bit of a rookie up there.
All right, and I want to bring in Mary Alice Parks, our White House correspondent, because the other interesting dynamic here, Mary Alice, is as we see in the zoomed-out version of the image we're looking at right now, there on the left-hand side of our screen is this Secretary of State. He is one of the other two people in the room right now, and you were just with him not too long ago in the Ukraine, which is likely to come up today. How do you think that's going to play into today's summit?
I think it's going to be a major part of the summit, Diane. It's notable to me that not only is the Secretary of State Blinken there in the room, but like you said, his first foreign trip was to the UK and then to Ukraine. It was just 100 days into this administration, and the Biden team wanted to make sure that the Ukrainian government on the ground felt the support of the United States government. It was exactly the kind of support that they were hoping to get from the Trump administration and struggled to get. Right off the bat, in the beginning of the Biden administration, we saw such aggression from the Russian army right there, like Terry's been talking about this morning. They amassed more troops on the Ukrainian border than we had seen in years. By some estimates, 100,000 troops. That border right there, that eastern border of Ukraine, is really the only hot conflict in all of Europe. And so it's a reminder, a very physical, tangible reminder that Europe feels this Russian aggression on the ground. It's not an abstract to them, but a deadly situation. The Ukraine struggling to maintain its own territorial boundaries. And this summit today, not only do we know that Ukraine has been on the Biden administration's minds, but more evidence of it. There's only 5 members from Biden's team that will be in that expanded meeting. And one of those 5 is the United States leading expert on Ukraine, number 3 at the State Department, Victoria Newland. She was there with me and the trip to Ukraine. She has a long experience in that region. The Ukrainians on the ground made a point of talking about how they know her, they feel comfortable with her, they were relieved to see her. So Biden made a point of having these experts in the room. He knew what he was doing. He knew that that would send a message to Putin, without a doubt, that the United States is trying to publicly stand with the Ukrainian government. But Diane, there's one other topic that I know we haven't talked about yet that will be a major part of this summit that I want to tee us up for some conversation around, and that's election meddling. The other big part of the last few years, American voters have been feeling the brunt of the disinformation campaign from Putin. We know that the Putin regime was actively trying to get Donald Trump reelected. And we've seen some sanctions, some response, some tough words in response to that disinformation campaign. But that was unbelievable, unprecedented level of election meddling, and something that we know the Biden administration wants to make sure doesn't happen again.
Yeah, there's so many interests going into this meeting. And Rick, in some ways, President Biden is getting criticized for just taking this meeting in general. The RNC communications director just released a statement on the summit saying giving Putin a meeting is just the latest win that Joe Biden has handed Russia, including waiving sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline while he crushes U.S. energy jobs at home. The American people deserve a leader who prioritizes our interests and holds bad actors accountable. So just kind of walk us through the politics behind the scenes of what goes into deciding to not only take this summit, but then also how to approach it once they're there.
Yeah, first, Diane, I'd have to note that President Trump, of course, met with Putin and had what was roundly seen as a pretty bad performance next to him, appearing to side with Putin's assurances about the last election over his own intelligence community. He also met twice with Kim Jong-un, which no other American president had done, because they didn't want to reward him for that. That aside, Biden knows that this is risky, and his own team was divided internally as to whether this was a good idea, whether to have this meeting or not. Putin needs this kind of attention. He thrives on this back home. He thrives on the world community, to be treated as a first-tier nation on the par of some of his predecessors during the Cold War. Russia isn't that kind of economy, isn't that kind of country anymore, although, as Terry noted earlier, it has the potential to be that at any given moment, given its access to as much information technology and, of course, nuclear weapons. But from Biden's perspective, as a new president, he wanted to send a signal that he's not afraid to sit down, and that knowing that we're at a low point of relationships, he's always fashioned himself over decades in foreign policy as an expert in this, and in reading people and reading the room, and in delivering messages personally. So he is the one that wanted to have this meeting. It's also the White House's call to not have the traditional joint news conference afterward, to see the two men at this on equal footing at podiums next to each other. He knows Putin's games. He knows that Putin is likely to mislead or outright lie about what happened behind closed doors, manipulate with his answers some of the takeaways of the summit. So he's going to let Putin go first and then have his final say, speaking to the press afterward before heading home after this long trip. I think, though, the idea of this summit, of having this meeting, Biden himself has signed off on it. He knows the risks involved in it. He knows how Putin manipulates and how Putin operates. He feels, though, that it's worth it, and it's worth it to just calm the tensions that we see right now, because there are so many different areas where Russia and the United States are coming into conflict. And as we've talked about, some of them are starting to impact Americans in a real way. When you're talking about access to the food supply, when you're talking about gas, we're talking about transportation. This is even on a different level than even election meddling, as serious as that is. People are feeling this. We're feeling the impact of it. And the message that Biden needs to and wants to deliver to Putin is that it has to stop.
And Rachel Scott, our Washington correspondent, joins us on the phone now from Geneva. Rachel, you're getting a really unique view of this whole thing as one of the very few American journalists who's actually credentialed to be with the Russian press corps throughout this event. What's that like?
Yeah, it is a very unique experience, Diane, and it's a little bizarre in many ways. I am one of the few American journalists, at least right now, that is with the Russian press corps at this moment. It's interesting that a lot of the White House press corps has actually been pushed away from where these two leaders are meeting inside. And the Russian press corps is out here. We are waiting for these leaders to come back out. I can tell you dozens of cameras of press standing here, judging any movement that happens, waiting for the doors to open, asking who shook hands first, what did they say? The world is watching this. You could feel the tension out here, just outside of the building where these two leaders are meeting. Our day started really early. We had to get a COVID test at 6 a.m. At a hotel in which the Kremlin was hosting. Outside, we saw a banner protesting the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, and then we saw that banner be taken down. I heard Russian aides sigh, roll their eyes, glossing over at that. But there is just no underscoring enough just how high stakes this meeting is for both sides. I can tell you that a lot of the Russian press, they are very intrigued by the American presence here. I've gotten a lot of questions about what my personal message is to Putin. How does it feel to be on the Russian side of things? And what types of questions that I would want to pose to myself. And that is the big reason into which why I am here on this side versus over on the White House press corps side. This is a very big difference that is happening this time around. Unlike the last time with former President Donald Trump, there will be no joint press conference. So each leader will be giving their own press conference. Up first is President Putin, and I'll be heading into that presser, Diane.
All right, Rachel, we'll let you go. And I want to bring in Steve Ganyard again to ask a little bit about that, because we heard Rachel bringing up Alexei Navalny. He's Vladimir Putin's most prominent opponent and was poisoned not too long ago, now imprisoned there in Russia. He's been the source of a lot of protests there. So, Ganyard, how does Biden tread this line when it comes to Russian issues? Because it seems from the Russian side that what Vladimir Putin wants going into this is also to cool down the tensions between the U.S. and Russia, but ultimately to tell the U.S. and Biden to mind their own business and not meddle in Russian issues. And if that is the case, then maybe Russia will behave a little bit better on the world stage. So how does Biden handle a situation like the poisoning of Alexei Navalny?
Yeah, I think what we've seen, Diane, up to this point of the Biden administration is that they have been willing to let domestic internal disputes be just Russian business. So, Navalny is no Thomas Jefferson. And so President Biden is not going to waste political capital on something that has no payoff. I think one of the things that we think about with these two hostages, these two former Marines, we think of that as domestic, but Putin wants to make that a U.S. issue. So the two fellows that were seized on trumped-up charges are there just as a way for Putin to continue to engage at the presidential level. The two potential tradees that they would be exchanged for, the former U.S. Marines, one is Victor Bout. And Victor Bout is an arms dealer that goes way, way back to Libya and arms dealing and Muammar Gaddafi and decades ago. And another one is an airline pilot who was busted for running drugs. Clearly, neither of these folks are people that Putin really cares about. What he cares about is the engagement. So he domestically trumps up charges on two American citizens in Russia and uses them as hostages to get President Biden's attention. But to the broader point, again, I think that the president has signaled that he's not going to get too interested in domestic politics. There are obvious human rights abuses within Russia. It's an authoritarian regime. It's a thuggish regime. We can call it names all day long, but it is what it is. It has been that way since 1945, and it will probably be that way in 2045 if it still exists. So I think that President Biden is going to lay some red lines down that affect his domestic priorities, that will allow him to focus elsewhere, to focus on China, and say, Putin, these are the red lines. We need to understand each other because I've got better and bigger things to deal with than you making trouble around the world.
And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, who's there in Geneva. Cecilia, the world has been watching and waiting in the buildup to this summit. And I know you're there at the Via Lagrange. You were there as the two leaders arrived. What's it like there in Geneva?
It is quite the scene, to say, Diane, the least. I'll show you this road behind me. This is closed for security reasons. We've undergone multiple security sweeps. Obviously, security really high here. And you mentioned this is, of course, a Swiss resort. We're dealing with two huge press delegations. I'm here, obviously, with the the White House press corps. There is an entire Russian delegation not too far away from me. And in the middle is this summit site where the two leaders are behind closed doors right now. You saw that footage that we were allowed to get in and show you, where you saw the two leaders inside with everybody, of course, analyzing the body language. Vladimir Putin sitting there, President Biden sitting there. Let me give you a little bit of behind the scenes on what happened. Not all of the the White House press corps made it inside that room. We're being told by some of the reporters who did get in that the Russian security were pulling on their clothes. There was screaming, there was shouting. So we're talking about an extremely chaotic scene out here. Normally, when it comes to these delegations with world leaders, it can tend to be a little chaotic. It can tend to be a little rough. Not like this, though. Certainly, this is an extraordinary event. And I'll tell you, just from being out here, when we came out earlier this morning, working here in the area where the White House press corps, we were quickly rushed out, offered by the White House to go to that location site and film it ahead of the two leaders arriving, because we were told the Russian delegation, the Russian press corps, was allowed to do that same thing. So there seems to be a little bit of a tit-for-tat thing happening here, and the coordination behind the scenes and the media management. If the Russian delegation gets something, the American press corps is hopefully being allowed to get that too. But when it comes to all of those reporters getting inside that room just now, it did not happen. It was very chaotic, guys.
So, Cecilia, at this point, how do we know about how the rest of the day is going to play out? We know they're having two meetings, one with this smaller group and then another with a larger delegations. Walk us through the timeline of how this is expected to all unfold.
It's going to be a long day out here, Diane. The White House is telling us to expect 4 to 5 hours of actual meeting time. They broke it down into two meetings. That first meeting is what's underway right now. That's what the cameras were allowed in for. You saw President Biden there, Vladimir Putin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. So that group, that small group of four, is having an extremely high level, very intense conversation. If you base that on what President Biden had said going in, that he was going to go in and lay down the red lines to Vladimir Putin. After that summit wraps up, that smaller group, then they expand it to a larger group where more aides will be brought in. The White House has told us that they allowed some flexibility in the schedule, so certainly highly choreographed, tightly focused schedule today, but they did leave some room in there for different things to happen. Who knows what's not on that schedule, Diane? We're told that the two leaders will not be, quote, breaking bread together. We don't expect them to have lunch, so that sort of tells you about the chilly personal relationship coming in. Certainly, this is not two leaders who have a lot of chemistry there. And we also know, I should note, that there will not be one-on-one time, at least not planned anyway, just for these two leaders to sit down, the two of them. And that's important because you'll remember President Trump did unusually have one-on-one FaceTime with Vladimir Putin, where just translators were allowed in. And we still, to this day, publicly anyway, don't know what was said during those private meetings, Diane.
All right, to be a fly on the wall for that meeting, Cecilia Vega in Geneva for us. Cecilia, thanks for staying on top of this for us. And let's take another live look at Geneva, where President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting right now. We have the latest with our team in Geneva right after a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back to our continuing coverage of President Biden and his summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We are covering this all day live on ABC News Live. And here's another look at the Via Lagrange in Geneva, where the two are meeting as we speak. They're just expected to discuss a number of topics, including recent cyber hackings as well as diplomatic expulsions. But one of the more recent developments, and something that may be discussed today, is a potential prisoner swap. And I want to bring in our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, for a little bit more on that. Martha, we know the family of Trevor Reed released this audio message from him, essentially begging the president to find a way to bring him back home. What's the latest on this potential swap?
Well, we don't know any details about that or whether that is even possible. It's certainly something that the United States wants, to have those prisoners released. Trevor Reed, who you mentioned, is a 29-year-old, 29-year-old. He is from Texas. He was over here meeting up with a Russian girlfriend who he met in Texas, and he was arrested after a night of drinking. The Russians say he accosted a police officer, and he has been in prison ever since. Now, I think the most likely person who could be released is probably Trevor Reed, because President Putin was asked about him, and he called him just a troublemaker and a drunk and not important. The more difficult release would be Paul Whelan. He is a 51-year-old. He is spending his 900th day in prison just today. He was in Russia. He was a frequent traveler to Russia, also a former Marine, as Trevor Reed is. He was traveling here. He was handed a flash drive. He said he thought it was pictures of churches in Russia, but it turned out to be classified material, according to the Russians. He has been in prison on espionage charges, so far, far more serious. And the deputy foreign minister of Russia said the other day that his offenses were severe, so he would not be included in any sort of prisoner swap. But at this point, Diane, we really don't know the status of that. It is certainly something that President Biden wants to bring up. There are several Russians in the U.S. being held. Victor Bout, an arms dealer. There is another one, a pilot who Putin has mentioned several times, who was arrested on drug charges, bringing drugs into the United States. So those are the names in play, but there are also others in the United States who have been held, other Russians, for other sorts of offenses.
And Martha, ultimately, what does success look like? What is a successful summit for both President Biden and President Putin coming out of this?
I think President Putin, you saw those pictures of President Putin with President Biden. That's essentially what he wants right there. That handshake in the same room, that body language is just incredible. David Muir and I were talking about it earlier, the relaxed President Putin sitting back in his chair, Joe Biden looking relaxed as well. All of this is so rehearsed. They know the world is looking at those pictures, especially Vladimir Putin. He wants to be on the world stage. He is probably going to list his grievances to the United States as well. You know, they go into this meeting, him denying there were cyber attacks, to him denying Russia had anything to do with that, but that's going to be a big topic with Joe Biden. I think because they have lowered the bar so far, but it's still a bar, that any progress will be seen as a win, according to Joe Biden, and probably according to Vladimir Putin, too. But we know there are things they agree on. They agree that Russia and the U.S. are at the lowest point they have been in so very long. And I think both of those men would like to improve relations and see what they can get done after that.
All right. Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz. Martha, thank you. And I want to bring in our Chief Congressional Correspondent, Mary Bruce, for a little bit more color on this. Because, Mary, we saw over the course of this week, Biden has been meeting with allies in the buildup to today's summit. How will those meetings impact the way he goes into this summit and the way he now conducts the discussions now that he's in that room?
Well, Diane, we know that this administration feels that the president is going into this summit today with the wind at his back. This has been, by all accounts, a very successful trip for him so far. We have seen him with the G7 at the NATO summit, really in a very, compared to what we've seen in the last administration, very controlled, very disciplined message from this president, hammering the argument that America is back, that democracy still works. And we know that he has the support of many allies as he heads into this meeting, despite some of the criticism that he's getting here at home, especially from some of his Republican opponents who say that the president is simply rewarding Vladimir Putin with this meeting. He does have the support of many of America's critical allies as he sits down today with President Putin. And that was important to feel for this administration, to feel that they had that as they come in to this really critical, high-stakes day. Even though this administration, of course, knows, you've heard it from the White House, you've heard it from the president himself, they're not setting setting high expectations. In fact, quite the opposite. They are setting very low expectations here. They have said there will be no deliverables, there will be no sweeping announcements coming out of this, yet they felt it was so important to do this in person. In fact, we heard that in that very chaotic press scrum. You could actually pick up the president saying it's always good to meet face to face. Biden saying that to Putin. And that's how this White House views this. That's how this president views this, that if you're going to try and sort of take the U.S.-Russian relationship into a new phase, that they had to have this face-to-face meeting so that President Biden could look Putin in the eye, make clear what the U.S. stands for, what will and will not be tolerated, and to try and somehow, if they can, agree on a new framework, if nothing else, going forward, so they can try and stop this downward spiral that has led to this low point that U.S.-Russian relations are now at. We have seen, of course, both leaders saying, sharing some kind words about each other before, heading into this meeting. Biden calling Putin a worthy adversary, Putin referring to Biden as a professional, and of course, just the fact that Putin showed up on time today, something he certainly has struggled with in the past as a bit of a power move. We've seen him in the past show up rather late for meetings with American presidents. Just the fact that he was there on time, the train started moving as expected, is at least a good start. Diane.
And Mary, in the past, we've heard American presidents go into a summit with Russia or previously the Soviet Union saying things like they're hoping to walk away with a positive relationship. What we heard from President Biden going into this was a stable and predictable relationship. What does that tell you?
That tells you exactly where the bar is, right? This is not a reset. That the White House has made very clear of that. They're not looking for some sweeping new sort of to hit the refresh button on the U.S.-Russian relationship here. They're looking to stabilize this relationship. They're looking to make it more predictable. You heard, we picked up in that chaotic press scrum there, the president also saying some of those words, because that's the goal here, is to find areas where perhaps they can work together going forward, even as President Biden is going to make it very clear to Putin where his red lines are on other areas, especially cybersecurity, as we've seen the run-up to this meeting, all of those cyber attacks on the U.S. And so this is not, again, they're not going to come out of this with some, signed dossier of agreement. They are simply looking for a chance to sort of start anew in many ways, for President Biden to make clear that, look, he is not President Trump. He's simply not going to take Putin's word at face value as President Trump did, but that there are areas where they may be able to work together going forward. So President Biden looking to somehow make some headway on a predictable relationship. President Putin, as we know, in many ways just wants respect. And he has gotten that today by this meeting, by getting this attention of the global stage.
All right, senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce. Mary, thank you. And I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, for a little bit more on this. Jonathan, we heard Mary there saying that Biden is essentially trying to look for places that they can work together. He knows this isn't going to be a super friendly relationship, but he's hoping to find some common ground here with Vladimir Putin. What are some of those areas where they might be able to do that?
Well, first of all, the United States needs Putin, needs Russia to address the continuing and ongoing crisis in Syria, where the power on the ground is Russia. Also, the biggest, the most immediate issue is the issue of cybercrime and criminal activity aimed at U.S. companies, aimed at U.S. government entities coming from Russia. There are many intelligence experts, intelligence officials in the United States who think this is not only emanating from Russia, but also it is happening with the cooperation and the implicit, if not explicit, okay of the Russian government. This is a major issue, is to deal with Russia on this. And you hear more talk in the United States of the need for the United States to be able to go on the offense on the issue of cyber offense, to be able to go and to not just try to defend U.S. entities from these cyber attacks, but to respond in kind. So it's interesting. We were discussing earlier how these summits over the years, particularly in the time of the Soviet Union, were focused on the issue of arms control and nuclear weapons. Well, now the arms that are the most first and foremost to be dealt with are these cyber capabilities. So that's really the issue. But one point Mary talked about how Putin wants this moment on the world stage. He's got it. There he is at a major summit, the eyes of the world. Putin, side by side with the leader of the United States. It's worth considering, as you look at that picture, that the Russian economy is about the size of Canada's. Russia is certainly a world power when it comes to nuclear weapons, but it is not a world economic power. It is not an equal to the United States in any other way other than those nuclear weapons. So this is something, when you hear Biden talk about Vladimir Putin as a worthy adversary, that's something that Putin wants to hear. It stands in contrast to what I remember Barack Obama saying about Putin and about Russia during another one of these meetings where Obama was quite dismissive, referred to Russia as a regional power, not a global power, but a regional power. Now, we see, Putin there side by side with Joe Biden, treated essentially as an equal.
So I want to bring in our political director, Rick Klein, on that, because, Rick, Biden is being criticized from some Republicans for having this summit at all. So how does he balance that, not wanting to give Vladimir Putin the spotlight that he wants and the legitimacy that he wants, but also, we heard Biden say right there in the room, there's nothing like talking face to face. He wants to be able to look this man in the eye and have a conversation with him about all of the problems that currently exist in this relationship.
Diane, he's the president, so he gets to do this, just like President Trump got to have meetings with Kim Jong-un and with Vladimir Putin himself. This is Biden's call, but they are so sensitive to every little detail surrounding this relationship. In fact, just moments ago, the White House communications director clarified there is no actual trust that he is affirming. He seemed to nod when he was asked that question earlier. The White House is saying they're saying verify, then trust.
All right, and I want to bring in David Muir, who's been there in Geneva actually covering this. David, you've been watching this the whole way from right there. What do you make of what you've seen so far? One, I think there's been a lot of surprise that Vladimir Putin was on time today, but even the way they shook hands, their body language in the room, what's your takeaway?
Well, it's extraordinary, Diane, and great to be with you here on News Live. The world is watching this. This is being held at a public park here in Geneva, not far from where I'm standing. We're on the shore of Lake Geneva here. In fact, this morning, we saw President Biden's motorcade travel here behind us. And on the lake just beyond, you can actually see the security presence, the heavy security presence all over Geneva. In fact, that public park heavily secured, that 18th century villa, the scene for this summit also secured. As you mentioned a moment ago, President Putin arriving on time, as John Carl pointed out in our coverage, rather uncharacteristic for Putin to be there, to be so punctual. Sometimes it can be used as a power play to show up late, but he did not do that this time around. He was followed shortly thereafter by President Biden. There you see Putin greeting the Swiss president before heading in to the villa and waiting for President Biden to arrive. Biden arrived here last night on Air Force One. After meetings, of course, at the G7, which you've been covering, Diane, and the NATO summit, the meeting with EU leaders. And the White House firmly believes that in playing out and planning out this international trip, today is day 8, by the way, for President Biden, in this particular order, that essentially the wind will be at Biden's back, they say, that he'll go into this summit positioned stronger, having signaled to NATO and to the G7 that America is back, that to NATO, we have your backs. And there you see Joe Biden shaking hands with the Swiss president, President Biden waving and then heading inside for a short time with Vladimir Putin. These are the images from the very beginning of the summit. We know this will play out in 2 parts. This is the first part of that meeting. President Biden joined by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart joining President Putin. Translators will be in the room. That's in stark contrast, Diane, to what we saw in 2018 in Helsinki. We know, of course, former President Trump in the room for quite some time with President Vladimir Putin without anyone, essentially. Only their translators. That was rather unorthodox. We will not be seeing that again today. Something else we will not be seeing is that joint press conference we all watched in 18 when former President Trump, there he is standing side by side with Vladimir Putin on that stage. They were in the summit, of course, on their own, and then on the stage afterward for the press conference where we all famously remember former President Trump siding with Vladimir Putin, who he said had just told him that he was not involved in election meddling, that Russia did not play a role in trying to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. Essentially, former President Trump choosing Putin's word over the word of his own U.S. intelligence agencies. That's not going to happen this time. There won't be joint press conferences. What we expect after this summit, which they tell us will be about 4 to 5 hours, that President Putin will speak to international reporters first, taking questions, and then President Biden will come out and take questions as well, Diane.
And David, what are you looking out for as the two men come out of this summit and give their own summary of how it all went?
You know, it's so interesting. You know, bureaucrats will call them deliverables. Essentially, what this means is, will these two leaders come out with any sort of list, albeit small, perhaps, of things that they can work on together, that they can assign working groups to tackle together? We know that the New START treaty they've already re-signed after President Biden became president. It's the only treaty that still exists post-Cold War when it comes to the two nuclear powers. They're expected to discuss that more at length. The question is the more thorny issues that they have to address today. Will there be any progress? First and foremost, the increasing number of cyber attacks, the ransomware attacks. Most recently, the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which, Diane, as you know, shut down gas stations up and down the East Coast, ran out of gas, and where stations remained open, we saw gas prices spike. We know that Colonial Pipeline paid a ransom north of $4 million to those hackers. We know U.S. authorities were able to claw back some of that money. Then we saw the other hack involving the U.S. meat supply and potentially affecting the largest U.S. meat supplier in our country, attacks on hospitals. Before that, we saw the cyber attack on the federal government. Multiple agencies hit in that SolarWinds attack. We also saw that on U.S. companies involved. And the concerning part of that is that the hackers had been inside U.S. government computers and inside the computers of U.S. companies for many, many months before it was discovered, mining data on their own. President Biden will no doubt bring that up with Vladimir Putin. You know, in recent days, Vladimir Putin was asked about that, Diane. He called it nonsense, that some of these attacks were Russian-based. But of course, that's in front of the camera. What happens inside these walls is a different story, whether or not there'll be progress on that. Will there be progress on Ukraine, amassing troops on the border yet again? Will there be progress on human rights? Alexei Navalny, who, of course, was poisoned and then imprisoned upon returning to Russia. All of these issues, no question, are on President Biden's list today. But when you ask the question of what do we expect on the backside of this summit, you know, Martha Raddatz asked Secretary of State Blinken this just a couple of days ago. He said the Biden administration setting low expectations for this, but that they'll know as soon as this summit ends if there's potential for bringing the temperature down, the tension down between these two countries.
Yeah, they have been careful to keep expectations measured around this whole event. And David, I know you'll have a lot more throughout the day with breaking coverage on the network and a full wrap-up on World News Tonight. Our David Muir. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Diane.
And I want to go to our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, again on this. Jonathan, it's a delicate dance that Biden has to do here in trying to show strength to Putin, but also not wanting to antagonize him. And this all happens in the backdrop as well of the G7 summit and the NATO summit, where Biden has made a lot of agreements with our allies that he, of course, will need congressional approval in order to carry through on. So how does that all factor in when you look at the big picture here?
Well, this trip, his first foreign trip, was carefully choreographed to set up a situation where before sitting down with Putin, he would first talk with our major economic allies in the G7, who, among the many issues that they jointly face is containing and dealing with Russia, and then, of course, NATO, which is set up to provide security. I mean, really, its original intention to provide security from the Russian military threat, and then to sit down, now that we are unified with our allies, economic allies, military allies, sitting down with Putin. But you're right. There were a lot of promises made, a lot of talk of a joint effort, a bilateral, multilateral effort to confront issues like climate change. Also, the agreement to have a minimum corporate tax of 15%. The talk of providing economic support for less developed countries. The Build Back Better global initiative that the G7 talked about, which will require the major industrial economies, including the United States, of spending a lot more money on foreign aid. Those are all things that need congressional approval. Those are not things that Biden can simply deliver on without getting Congress to go along. Major questions in each one of those, whether or not Congress will be there with him. But I think that the significance of those two previous meetings in terms of this summit was the message coming from Biden that, in contrast to the Trump years, the United States is going to be working closely with our allies. The talk of America first, if necessary, America alone is gone. It is now we are united as democracies, united against the threats coming from Russia and, by the way, also from China.
And I want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, for a little bit more color on this. Because, Mary, we heard David mention that we're not going to see a side-by-side press conference today the way we saw after President Trump's summit with Vladimir Putin. Instead, Vladimir Putin's going to come out. He's going to give his press conference, and then President Biden will come out and give a separate press conference. We haven't heard a ton from the White House on what to expect from today, but they were pretty quick to make that clear. What went into that decision?
Well, the president, actually kind of remarkably, to hear a president explain, how dedicated he is to making sure that he has control of the optics of this. And that's really what this is about. The president doesn't want this to turn into some big spectacle. He said he doesn't want, all of us in the press and the public to be sitting there scrutinizing, every handshake, reading into their body language as they stand side by side in a press conference. And of course, we all know what happened the last time President Putin had a press conference with an American president. Biden has been very careful to control and carefully choreograph really this entire trip, but especially today. That is a very hard thing to do with a leader that can be as unpredictable as President Putin. But Biden wants to make sure that coming out of this, that he's able to control the narrative. He has said as much. So that's really the thought behind making sure that coming out of this, Putin has his chance to have his say. He'll give his readout of the meeting. President Biden will give his.
And I want to bring in Steve Ganyard for a little bit more on this, too, because, Steve, one of the questions that keeps coming up is how much Biden can trust Putin. How much does this summit really mean if he can't? There's even a debate right now over whether he nodded affirmatively at a reporter during that scramble in the room right before the press was kicked out, when the reporter asked if he thought that he could trust Vladimir Putin. So how much does that play into what happens today?
And even when Ronald Reagan said trust but verify, he didn't really mean it. He just meant verify. And that's been the relationship between the U.S. and Russia since really the end of the Second World War. And so there is no trust and everything needs to be verified. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The performance counts, is particularly in diplomatic relations. Particularly when the U.S. has grievances like the cybersecurity hacking and ransomware. So I think that we don't worry about whether we trust each other or not, because we don't. And it's probably a good thing, and it's probably in the best interest of both countries. It's why when we have nuclear arms agreements, that there's always inspections. When we have things like flying over the other country to look at various sites, they are open and they are inspected. And so this verification part is the most important part, far more important than trust. And again, I'd offer that trust is not important, and it's important that we don't trust Putin.
And I want to bring in Elizabeth Newman, former DHS Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy, because, Elizabeth, you say one of the things that Biden needs to be on the lookout for today from Putin is gaslighting. Why?
Right. So there's this history of the Russians trying to invert the arguments. I've been in meetings, usually they're counterterrorism fora with partner countries, 100 countries that came together to defeat ISIS and other forums like that. And one of the common things I noticed over the years is that they have this tendency to take arguments that we are making and we often are using diplomatic language in environments like this, kind of encouraging a proper approach to Syria, for example, when we know that Russia was cozying up to Assad and helping.
Looks like we may have lost Elizabeth's connection. We're going to work on getting her back. But Steve, I wanted to ask you a follow-up because we have heard President Biden say that if Russia doesn't stop, for example, launching cyber attacks against the U.S., that the U.S. will, quote, respond in kind. We've heard those words a lot, respond in kind, from the president. What exactly does that look like? What are Biden's options if Putin doesn't play nice?
Yeah, so this is the whole concept, Diane, of hacking back, taking offensive cyber operations. Now, there's some real danger there because letting the genie out of the bottle is the real danger, because some of these offensive operations, for instance, if you go after somebody's financial system, you don't know what the second and third order effects cascading through a financial system, how that may blow back onto your own financial system. So hacking back has some limitations, but it also has some dangers because you could start a fire that you really can't control. So I do think that this administration has had a long time, and the Democrats have had a long time to think about, since the DNC hacks, what would we do? What would we tell the Russians to make them stop? Again, you have to do something that is going to get President Putin's attention, and that means a 2x4 or the threat of a 2x4 between the eyes. And I think that's what has been carefully crafted over the past couple months is the U.S. response to the continued cyber hacking and cyber attacks by Russia. So my guess is that they have some very good talking points, some very good ideas, and that behind the scenes, the U.S. has crafted some policies that will allow them to turn up the heat on Putin if he fails to turn down the number of cyber attacks and ransomware attacks that Russia has been conducting on the U.S.
Now, Elizabeth, the U.S. has been behind the eight ball in a way when it comes to cyber, both in relation to Russia and in relation to China. So does the U.S. actually have the capability to match Russia here and respond in kind the way Biden is saying?
Oh, absolutely. We have the capability. The question is one of we follow the.
All right, looks like, again, we lost Elizabeth. Sorry about that, folks. We're going to try to fix that connection. But Mary Bruce, same question to you. What do we know at this point? Mary Alice Parks, what do we know at this point about what our capability is in the U.S. to be able to respond if Russia continues with these cyber attacks?
Well, I think that Steve Ganyard would know better than me that we try to make sure the average global citizen doesn't know the full extent of American intelligence responses. I mean, we work really hard to keep our options sealed. I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that Americans want to see a response. They want to feel a response. They have felt like Russian disinformation and disruption has impacted their lives. Everything from the cyber attacks that have led to rising gas prices, to concerns about whether they can buy a hamburger, to feeling like they're watching Russian disinformation scroll on their Facebook pages. Americans feel like the United States needs to stand up and respond, but how that happens, what that looks like, is probably extremely covert. And so that's going to be hard for President Biden to be able to probably engage on pretty behind-the-scenes covert activities to respond to Russia, but be able to show publicly to Americans that he's standing up for them and that he's responding in a big way. One thing we know that's been public has been the expulsion of some Russian diplomats and, of course, new layers of sanctions. But so far, we haven't seen the Russian government change its course or change its behavior. It's hard to imagine that another round of kicking kicking diplomats out of D.C. or lobbing more sanctions is going to make much of a difference. I mean, Steve Ganyard gave this great visual about hitting sort of Russia with a metaphorical 2x4. I don't know what that looks like, but I think that there's a lot of Americans that are hungry for that.
And Steve, it does seem from what we're hearing from Russian diplomats that Putin also wants to be able to walk away from this with the tensions cooled between the U.S. and Russia. So what are some sticking points you think that are easy places where he can give a little in today's summit?
So, Diane, let me offer a contrary view. I don't think that Putin wants to turn down the heat. As all of our colleagues have noted here, Putin wants attention. To Terry's point, Texas has a bigger GDP than Russia does. Russia is a brute and a bully, and it is a regional power, but it has nuclear weapons. And so this goes back to what is cyber? Why does Putin do this? Because it's an asymmetric capability. The Russians won't be able to compete with the U.S. in terms of military capability. So hacking gives them the ability to do things where we've seen they've actually disrupted critical infrastructure, both oil and the food supply chain within the United States. So I don't think Putin has any intention of throttling back his cyber hacks, and I don't think he has any intention of turning things down. It is in his best interest to continue to portray the United States as the enemy of the state, the enemy of the Russian people, that portray himself as the leader of a country that stands on the stage with other countries, even though they don't rate it in terms of economic power. So I'd offer that contrary view there, that I don't think he wants to turn it down, and I don't think he will. I think he will listen and he'll make some demands, but I think that Mr. Putin would prefer the status quo and to be able to maintain a place on the world stage by being an annoyance and being a threat to regional powers.
Well, so given that view, Steve, do you think it was a mistake to have this summit?
No, I think it's absolutely a great. It was a very, very good idea, I think, on the part of the Biden administration. Why? Because this administration has some very defined domestic policy goals, and the margin of error in the Congress is very narrow. And so the president wants to be able to focus on those, and he wants to focus on what he believes is the primary international threat, and that is China. If you looked at both the G7 and the NATO, the new pronouncements that came out were not about Russia. They were about the threat that China poses to the world. And so as the U.S. begins to shift and focus internationally on China, and the Biden administration says, I have to do some things here before the fall in case we lose the Congress, I think that they want Mr. Putin put in a box, and they want him just to be able to make sure that he's not a nuisance and that they don't have to spend time on him. And by doing that, by laying out some very clear red lines, I think that they're trying to get their priorities straight and do the housekeeping they can before they turn their attention to their domestic political issues.
All right. And here's another live look at Geneva, where President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin are meeting right now. That's an earlier shot there from them in the room. And here's a live look at Geneva. We're going to have the latest on that summit and a look back at 1985. A look at another historic summit when Russia was the Soviet Union. Stay with us.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.